Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today on this very exciting webinar. I'm Michelle Van Noy, Director at the Education and Employment Research Center, and I'm so thrilled today to be sharing this webinar with co-sponsoring with the Community College Research Center, as well as the National Council on Workforce Education, Tom Barak and Kate Kinder from both organizations here. Thrilled to have this opportunity to bring together this panel to reflect on and learn from our very esteemed colleague Jim Jacobs, his friend, mentor, colleague for many, many years for many of us here, to learn about his findings from his book, reflecting on his career, moving a community college forward. My story as an educator, researcher, president, and radical. That is the title of the book. For those who don't know Jim, probably many of you do. You're here for this, but he was president at Macomb Community College for close to 10 years, but had a very long career at Macomb, close to 50 years, I believe, at Macomb. But did many, many other things as well. Was an organizer before coming into higher education. Was a researcher at points, which is where I met him when he was at the Community College Research Center. An administrator, a faculty member. So many, many hats and many lessons for us, I think, on community colleges, the community college role in workforce development, and many more things. So I don't want to go on. I'm going to turn things over to Jim to share a little bit about his book, and then Tom Brock is going to moderate a panel with the rest of our panelists, Joe Blondin, Kate Kinder, and Tom Bailey, to reflect on what Jim will share. But we're going to start off with just hearing from Jim. His own version of some of the wonderful takeaways from the book, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion, and then hear from panelists. So, Jim, please share.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, Michelle, for this, for the introduction. And I do want to thank the Education and Employment Research Center, based at Rutgers, the Community College Research Center, Teachers College, Columbia University, and the National Council of Workforce Education. It's really an honor to have three distinguished groups hold this kind of session. So hopefully we'll engage in an interesting conversation. I mean, the book discusses what I did, but obviously on this, panel will be people who will be talking about the future of community colleges as well, which I think we all share some interest in. So let me quickly say something about there are three interrelated themes in the book. The first theme is really a kind of review of the history of workforce development in community colleges over the last 30 or 40 years. With specific reference to Macomb Community College as it developed as an important organization for workforce development in the Detroit region, and specifically with the auto industry. That's one theme. The second theme is sort of my time as president of the college, the kinds of things I tried to do as president of the college to move the institution in certain directions, some success and some failures. And the third is really a personal narrative. I mean, I came to Macomb Community College in 1967. I didn't know much about community colleges at all, but how the college, both I had some effect on the college and the kind of things I learned about community colleges, but also how the community colleges changed my perspective. And that kind of personal narrative is part of the book as well. Now, there are many things to talk about in terms of community college activities in the workforce space. But I want to focus in on a couple of things that I think are important themes for our future work. Certainly in the last 30 years, community colleges have done important activities in workforce development, and we've learned a great deal. On the other hand, we're also faced with enormous challenges. And I just want to quickly go through some of those challenges and talk a little bit about what I think are some of the issues around those challenges. The first is we are significantly losing enrollment among adults in our career and technical education programs for a number of reasons, including maybe the relevance of some of our programs. Our enrollment has declined significantly, and that's not something that started with COVID. It was obviously something that occurred earlier. Second, in large part, with the exception of the healthcare areas, in large part, employers are not using community colleges as a place where they will access their skill needs. In other words, the linkage between employers and students who finish our programs, get certificates, get degrees, and then get hired into work is not a very stable relationship. And third, and I think again very importantly, in many ways our success in workforce development has encouraged us to have multiple programs, many different activities going on simultaneously. We've spread ourselves very, very thin, and given the equipment needs, the need for professional development of our faculty, all these activities are becoming more and more difficult to hold all of them up in the air at one time. In some ways, the breadth of our activities has kind of made it more difficult for us to penetrate deeply into certain areas. Why are some of these issues occurring, and how do we deal with them in the future? I think one of the reasons why these issues are occurring is that for the most part, over the last 20 or 30 years, in the workforce area, we've developed what I call a transactional approach to workforce development. And that transactional approach means if we listen to what the companies say and develop our curriculum and our courses around what those companies want, they will then hire our students. And as the first slide indicates, there's some real limitations to this approach. First, companies don't often express their needs very well. Many of us who've gone through years of asking companies, well, tell us what you want. It's often very difficult to isolate the specific skills that companies are interested in. Skill needs are often not sufficient to attract students into these programs. Students are interested in the working conditions, the opportunities for success and advancement, the requirements of their interest often doesn't fit with what the skill needs just of the companies. Third, by focusing on one or two companies, in a sense, we focus on the trees and we miss sometimes the forest. What are the important sectors in our community? What are the important employers in our community, and how we can work with them as a group becomes, I think, an important area that gets diminished often when we just use a very narrow transactional approach to workforce development. And finally, in some ways, this approach also minimizes the college's ability to and resources that what we can bring as educators, as people who have spent years educating adults and young people, knowing the pedagogy, knowing a little bit about work-based learning, how we can also contribute. There are now many colleges that have taken a broader perspective, and Macomb is one of them, but there's certainly others. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go over that in this. But let me just kind of, in the next slide, move to what would be what a new approach would look like. First, this approach would look not just at the needs of particular employers in our community, but the community itself and the needs of students, and how we can merge those three together and develop programs that meet them. That becomes, I think, the real future for workforce development activities at the community college level. Second, this is not something that you can just say workforce development is a part of the institution and we have 15 advisory boards, or we have 2 or 3 great customized trainers who really know the companies, etc. This is a practice that has to be imbued in the top leadership of the organization, and that the organization has to take seriously the need of the community for certain kinds of skill building activities, to not only to maintain the current economic infrastructure, but to also hopefully develop economic development of the community. Third, our relationship with students is not over once they get a certificate or a degree, but it continues as supporting student success at the workplace. In fact, student success becomes a much broader perspective that isn't over once the course is completed, etc. And I think some great work will be done in that area in the next couple of years by some of the work that the CCRC has been initiating. And finally, the college then becomes, in a sense, positioned as both an advisor and a contributor to the work-based learning activities of employers. We become, we always often use the term partner, but
it's like a nice pool day.
The partners become something very, very different. So this all is going to require a refocusing and certainly some changes in the way in which we conduct workforce development. If we could go to the next slide. And what that means is a much more narrowing of what we do in terms of the breadth of our programs. The days, I think, are over where a community college should be having 150 or 200 workforce programs. The curriculum that we have needs to be focused more on what are the key constituencies in our community that we need to serve, how we develop deeper ties with them. So in a sense, less done well is better. The second, the community leadership, the community college leadership needs to develop closer ties both with the companies and economic development activities in the communities. It means a different kind of administrators. It means a different kind of researchers inside the institution. It means a lot more cooperation, learning and development, and consortium building. Third, while the emphasis is on credentials, the emphasis in terms of the institutions should also be on employment and ties with alumni, and keeping the community college as a validator for those students who go through our programs. And finally, we become a kind of valued expert on work-based learning strategies. We become something in the community as a place to go when one needs to acquire skills to be successful. And those are placing us in those roles, I think, will be extremely important. We're at a very good position. In a sense, we're all being given the opportunity to think about, workforce Pell and its implications to our programs. But if we can think about broadening this issue of transactional approach, I think we'll be much more successful. If we go to the last slide, this is, again, a copy of this is sort of the shameless advertising slide. If you need to get a copy of the book, both the Q and R codes, either for the publisher or Amazon. And at this point, I will just stop and turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for sharing all your insights with us. And I wanted to, spend a little bit of time just asking you a couple of questions to just further probe some of the things you've shared. I think these are really, really important insights for us and for the field going forward. And we learned so much from all of your work over the years. And I'm curious. I think one of the things that reflecting on the book and everything you've done in your career is you had so many different kinds of roles. You held many different roles, and you transitioned across these different roles at different points in your career. And I'm really curious to hear you talk a little bit more about some of the insights, maybe even surprising insights you might have made as you went across each of those transitions, and how they inform, what this all these this approach that you've been sharing with us and your insights on where the field should go.
Yeah, I think, and this is probably true with everyone, um, you know, you do change, and you build upon your skill needs. And I was fortunate enough to um, have transitions where I was able to take some of the skills I learned. I mean, for example, as a political organizer, I learned how to listen to people. And one of the things that I think makes for a very successful president is a president isn't just sitting up and taking command and talking forever about what they think is important. To be good in a community, you have to be credible, and one of the ways you're credible is you listen to people. Uh, the fact that I did and spent a good many years with Tom Bailey and you, Michelle, and others at the Community College Research Center made me think about how research could play a role in the way in which we conduct activities at the college. So research became fundamental in terms of being a successful, president. You had to have not just a thought of why things should change, but you had to have data to support it, etc. And I think for all of us who started in community colleges in the 1980s, and we always depended on just anecdotes and little nice stories of successful people that successful students that we came across. Having a research base, and I think community colleges have really moved very much forward in accepting the research and using it to really develop programs, etc. That's been part of it. So I think one of the things that I would say about any of us in terms of our own development is we can take on skills that we learn in previous lives or previous perspectives and utilize that inside the community colleges to be successful.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's lessons for us all to think about. Thanks, Jim. Um, so one other question for you, just thinking about, what you've seen over your career and I think you got into this and somewhat on your presentation, but I guess I'm curious just to hear you reflect a little bit more on what you see as being the challenges of the moment that are confronting higher ed. I mean, we are in a moment for higher ed, which for many reasons is challenging. And, I'm curious, what advice do you have for current college leaders to engage with those challenges of the moment?
Yeah, this is a big one. I mean, it isn't just dealing with all the craziness of Donald Trump and his entourage about how, but I think it's more. I mean, if you look at it in the broadest perspective, when I started at Macomb in the 1960s, probably 10 to 15% of the American population had any college degrees whatsoever. Um, Now, the broadest category is people with some college in terms of education background. So we've made sort of higher education a mass commodity. It's not something which is just for the elite. And as a result of that, I think we've tended to use the same structures and dialogue and cultural ways of operating as four-year institutions, and even community colleges who are a whole lot more flexible, etc., still fall into that same, general perspective, not recognizing that for many people now, they perceive college as a way in which they get a better job. That's their perception, or a better opportunity. And we're not really structuring ourselves often to meet with that opportunity. Now, again, I would drill down and say, I think we in the community colleges are far more advanced in understanding that than many of the four-year schools. I think we have integrated our programs far more around student success, and I'm extremely encouraged. I mean, compared to even 20 years ago, of how well the individual colleges are looking at themselves and critiquing themselves, and the whole pathways and student success initiatives, which many of you are part of, have really made a significant difference in our work. Yet there's clearly more that needs to be done. And the strength that we have as community colleges is that our students stay in the community. So we need to know a whole lot more than what we know now about our communities, about where people get jobs, etc. One of the things that I used to do at Macomb is I would talk with employers and say, where did the last 5 people you hired come from? And almost never did they say they came from Macomb Community College. They came from family members. They came from other. That we need to realize that our position in the communities is not as stable, or is more tenuous than we really think, and that, I think, becomes a future important requirement for us to be successful in the future.
Definitely a lot of things to continue thinking about in terms of the role of the community colleges and our local engagement. And I want to turn things over at this point to Tom Brock to welcome our panelists and begin to moderate a discussion reflecting on all the insights from Jim's book.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Happy to do that. So, hello, everyone. I'm Tom Brock. I'm the director of the Community College Research Center here at Teachers College, and I am really pleased to introduce our panelists. We have 3 very distinguished individuals, distinguished in their own rights, but also people who have interacted with Jim over the course of their careers. So first we have Jo Blondin. She is the president of Clark State College in Springfield, Ohio, a role that she has held for 13 years, but she has over 30 years of experience in higher education. So welcome, Jo. Our second panelist is Tom Bailey. He is the president of Teachers College here, where I sit. And very importantly, Tom was the founder of the Community College Research Center, an organization he led for a little more than 25 years before ascending up to the presidency role at Teachers College. So welcome, Tom. And then thirdly, we have Kate Kinder, who's the executive director of the National Council for Workforce Education, where she supports a national network of community colleges and their partners to advance excellence in workforce education. Welcome, Kate. Really a pleasure to have all of you. So, Jo, I'd like to just start off with you and ask you to reflect a little bit as a community college president. So you have a long career to look back on, and I'm sure you have mentored many aspiring presidents over the course of your career. I'm just interested in kind of what insights you gleaned from Jim's book around leadership qualities. What really makes a difference to be an effective community college president? What should new or aspiring presidents take away from Jim's experience to help them in their roles?
So thank you for that, Tom. And this book is, first of all, uh, so relevant now. I know you're reflecting back on your career, but a lot of the insights, I mean, you were an early adopter of so many things, Jim. So I'm thinking about Dream Keepers, for example. Dream Keepers is a program that would offer emergency funding. Now, every college in the country has an emergency fund or is trying to establish one. And so we're talking about 20 years ago. I mean, some of the work that you did, the Pathways work, that has become the Guided Pathways movement. So many of those programs really started with needs at Macomb Community College. And I know people say, if you've been to one community college, you've been to one community college. But I would argue that Macomb was an absolute incubator for many of the ideas that have become reality in the community college and higher ed worlds. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say too that Jim was a very aspirational figure to me. In fact, maybe even a mythic figure at the National Council for Workforce Education. When I first started getting involved, of course, he would present, moderate panels, etc. And I got to know him then, and then had the very nerve-wracking experience in 2010 of moderating a panel with him in the front row. And I think he accepted my presentation. I think he thought I did okay. But I really always appreciated his guidance and leadership. And after that, I got to be friends with him and had a lot of opportunity to work with him, particularly in the automotive program development areas as Clark State was coming on and tacked round with our tacked grant round four. Macomb was kind of our mentor in that too. So one of the insights I do want to share though, there are a few things that college presidents, aspiring college presidents, retiring college presidents should take from Jim's book. And number one is, and I think it's been on display fully here, is his absolute humility and his leadership in making or in certainly leading difficult decisions, but also involving so many of the stakeholders. If when you read his book, you will see how closely he worked with the faculty and staff as needed, but also there were times where the decisions had to be made, and of course Jim was always was that strong leader. The other area that I would say too is in establishing goals. So from the very beginning, and I know that I benefit from this when I was reading about his process. He established four goals almost instantly in when he became president, and they were around workforce development, which he is known for that, of course, but also academic partnerships, new sources of revenue, and a regional focus. And you heard him talk a lot about regional focus, but I think those are also absolutely critical areas today. It sounds like a 2026 strategic plan, and he was doing this 25, 30 years ago. So I think that this is almost a manual for new presidents. And then finally, I will say this: when I needed advice, and certainly he was a role model in this area, but he worked with a board of trustees like nobody else, and they were partners in student success. And so I would just also add that there are a lot of lessons learned in this book about working with the various stakeholders. But as president, Jim knew the most important stakeholder you have is the board so that you can impact students. And so those are my insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. So Tom Bailey, if I may turn to you next, would love to hear kind of your thinking when you invited Jim to become the Associate Director of CCRC. What were you looking to achieve? And then perhaps can you share an example or two for us about how Jim and his presence at CCRC may have influenced or improved the research that CCRC does?
You're muted.
Sorry. I know. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can't have a Zoom meeting without somebody failing to take off their to unmute. So I'll have to say that I haven't been working on community colleges, for 8 years, and so reading this book made me a little melancholy to think about the work that I'd done, the work that I did with Jim. And, but I think there's also an interesting thing about his history, where he started out in radical and protest and he ended up a president. And that's pretty much there's something about that is it parallel to me, although our routes were very different. And also I know Michelle said that Jim had a lot of different roles, but I mean, I think his answer was very good, or I would say that those really integrated well. I don't think mine is integrated as well as his, but I mean, I mean, I think that the influence of even the radical politics that he had, the commitment that he had to his students and what he was trying to do with that, I think those, as then of course his work on workforce development, his work in research around those areas, and then that really, I think, did provide a really solid foundation for him to, to go on to be president. So I don't know it's possible to design a life like that, but if you could, that would probably be a good way to go about that. Now, I mean, I was. I will have to say, when I was in graduate school in economics, I didn't know what a community college was, so I had no background in that, and the research that we did was kind of abstract. I mean, okay, we're going to do we did research on workforce development before we started the Community College Research Center, so there was kind of a research aspect of that, but I realized that you know we're an Ivy League institution, and it's easy for us to come into some place and tell people what to do, and then we go back to New York and leave behind the school with all of the challenges that they had. And so I think there were two things about why would anybody listen to us, right? Even if we had good things to say. So that was one thing, but also what did we know? What was our background? I mean, I certainly couldn't go and talk any kind of, I had to fake it for a while because, I couldn't say I had knowledge or experience in community colleges. So I think getting Jim on board, which I forget exactly. I mean, we got you onto the advisory board, I think, right away, and then hired you. And I think it was interesting that Jim never left. I mean, never moved to New York, and commuted back and forth. He talks about that in the book, and I think that was good. I think that really, he was rooted at Macomb Community College. So I think it allowed us to, I mean, first learn from him and all of the context that he had and the world that he brought into us. But I think it made us more credible. And I think it really affected us in a way I think, when I ultimately, when I was working on this, the conference that was most important to me was the AACC conference. It wasn't the American Education Research Association. Actually, that's not helped me out as president, where that's what I should have been, president of Teachers College. I should have been living in the ARA, but no. And but I think, we were proud of that. I mean, many of the presentations and the research we did were joint projects. So I do think that it's that sort of overcoming this gap between the snooty Ivy League people who, tell you what to do and then go home to their cushy jobs, and then, and then actually doing something which has an effect and is listened to. I think that's crucial about what CCRC has been able to do. And I think much of that is, we can attribute to Jim. So anyway, I mean, it was, we had a great time. I remember when I was offered this job, I remember having breakfast with Jim in the kitchenette, a place we had breakfast all the time, which unfortunately closed immediately with COVID. So that was sad, and said, yeah, Tom, you should take the job. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that was good advice in retrospect, but nevertheless, so as I said, it was a great collaboration that we had. And I enjoy reading the book because it shows that, we contributed something to Jim, and he certainly deserved that given what he had done for us.
Thank you so much, Tom. And let me just say, at least from my standpoint, I'm glad that you listened to Jim's advice. So I had this opportunity. Thank you both. I would not be here, but for both of you. So, Kate, if I may turn to you, really am interested in your thoughts as somebody who's been trying to advance workforce education really throughout your career. I'm wondering, reflecting on some of the issues he mentions in his book, was Jim ahead of his time in some ways? And if so, how? And what lessons do you take away from Jim's experience?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here on behalf of NCWE. And then prior to this role, the bulk of my career I spent at a community college that was very engaged in National Council for Workforce Education. So got to experience the benefit of Jim and many others' work through that and just the importance of workforce education. So I do think Jim was very, as it's been touched on already, ahead of his time in the sense that many colleges for decades have been focused on providing workforce training to meet the needs of local employers, whether that's through incumbent worker training, career and technical education. But I think Jim really saw how that was a through line through a community college, that really that is needs to be integrated and remove the silos between liberal arts, transfer, credit, CTE, non-credit. So those are the conversations that are very much happening right now. And Jim saw that early on, that really we need to honor the needs of our community, our employers, and our students. So thinking about all of that, and the best way we can achieve that is by removing those silos, creating the false bifurcation we have between programming and really creating pathways. So I think it was encouraging to see that that work has long been happening, and I'm very inspired by the potential going forward and the prompting that Workforce Pell will provide for many colleges to finally remove those silos. I think the other piece too is really what's already been mentioned is not having a transactional approach for workforce education where it really needs to be transformational, and so working with employers as part of an ecosystem, which also means working with sectors, which means questioning some of their practices that aren't creating fair opportunities for our students. It means advocating for the needs of working parents or those who are working low wages, and then really thinking comprehensively about the supports that our students need. So that big view of student success, it's not just fall to fall retention. It's not just completing the credential. It's how do they get into a job that provides better opportunity for their families, better wages, but also just more vitality, right, for their communities. So I think that connection to democracy and civic engagement is also a big component of community colleges and that transformative power. And that really workforce is a key part of that, given that footprint that workforce has and how much you engage in your place in your community. So I think that was very ahead of the time and really key, especially at this moment in our history. And then I also just really, really appreciated, as was mentioned before, the importance of listening to people that we're working with and that we're serving. And so I think that whether that's staff and faculty, whether that's employer partners, whether that's CBOs, whether that's faith-based leaders and organizations, I think that importance of listening and connecting the dots. And then also really listening to our students and honoring their experience. So I appreciated really calling that out, that people wanted workforce education pathways because they needed immediate economic payoff because their lives were complex. And so I think that's really important that we move away from creating these false hierarchies of which learning is valued, which credentials hold value, and which learners we tend to listen to more. And I think that is going to be key, both in our economic vitality for our communities, but also in really a healthy democracy. And so that means that we need to value the micro-credential pathway up to the PhD, but stop creating a hierarchy of which learning matters more. And what we think is best for students, we need to listen to what is best for students. So I appreciate that foresight. I appreciate the work that EERC is doing in that space and CCRC to really talk about how we create pathways for better economic mobility.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm going to open it up for questions from our listeners in just a minute. I see one question in the chat already. If anyone else listening would like to ask a question of Jim or our panelists, please put it in the chat and we'll do our best to get to you before our time is up today. But let me first just ask one more question of the panelists here. There have been a few references on this webinar about just the challenging times for higher education right now. And we all feel it, we can name it. And yet, I guess for me, as I read Jim's book, it was encouraging in a way just to be reminded that we've been through some pretty serious
Right.
challenges before. Jim references, of course, the student protest movements that were taking place in the 60s and 70s. He mentions, times under Ronald Reagan when, there were, some pretty significant changes in federal policy that affected community colleges and others of us working in this sector. So for our panelists, I guess just taking the long view, looking back at Jim's career and where we are right now, are there other lessons that you take away? Are there particular points that you would like to underscore, perhaps for early career people listening to today's webinar, or individuals perhaps just starting their presidency at a community college? What can they take away from Jim's experience to give them hope and encouragement moving forward?
I'm happy to take that one first, if it's acceptable. I would say too that Jim has a few pages in the book, but it's really a through line, and he talks about consistency. He talks about how important consistency is to leadership, and I think that nobody had to guess where Jim was on an issue. At the same time, I think that that steadiness gets underrated. I think that people all think, when we talk about developing leaders, that you're this constant, always a high profile person out there. And I think that a lot of the work that Jim has done has been loud in the community college world, but quiet in terms of his seeking that recognition. And I think that made him a great leader. And I really took the consistency piece out of that. I think that's absolutely important and the most underrated virtue in a college president or a college administrator. The other thing that I would say too is that he asks the question that we're still asking, and unfortunately now maybe some legislators are asking the questions too. Do we have the right programs? And that sounds like just a run-of-the-mill question that any president might ask, but it's not. That's a very, very challenging question to ask because of all of the stakeholders, right? Jim talks a lot about the employers, the faculty, the students, et cetera. But I think that, do we have the right programs right now? And Kate mentioned the equity gaps, the making sure that our students earn good wages. And I think Jim really had those conversations before a lot of us did. It wasn't just about enrollment. It wasn't just about multiple partnerships and being acquisitive. Jim's leadership was not about being acquisitive. It was about asking the right questions so that the result would be the very best stewardship of a college. So I would say that. And then finally, I would also want to lift up his focus on working with students after they graduate. So this is a very future focused approach, because what Jim is really proposing is, and has through his whole career, and now everybody's saying, yeah, we really need to get students back in certificate programs and a lifelong learning model and stackable credentials. Well, he's been doing this all along. Has he branded it as the Jim Jacobs stackable credential model? Absolutely not, because that's not who he is. But I think that those are some lessons too that I took away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Tom Bailey, did you want to answer that question?
If I can get off mute. Well, actually, I'll take a little different, view. Since I'm not running a community college, I'm not sure what to say. I mean, certainly all of the leadership suggestions that people have talked about, and I read through Jim's book, and got to the 4 goals that he had, and I go back and said, did I have those goals, and what were those? So, but I think that going back to his origins in really wanting to think about changing society. I think while we should definitely be thinking about what programs are there. I mean, I think about that all the time here. We have too many programs, and I wish we were more focused as well. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that we've always emphasized the role that community college plays in a, you know, in a society, a democratic society that tries to move forward and that tries to reach for equity. And these institutions are such crucial parts of that. And I think we should be making more of that, especially because, I mean, it is, I mean, something else, another part, thing that Jim talks about is the sort of bipartisan nature of community colleges. That is, and I would notice that. I mean, but when I was involved with community colleges, things weren't so polarized as they are now. But you never knew what the party of the people we were talking to, and there were plenty of presidents who were devoted to the mission of community colleges, whatever wherever they voted. So I think there's an opportunity that we have there to think about the role of community colleges in the broader society and what really positive aspects, and so that's probably something, more, in addition to thinking about the day-to-day operations of the institutions. But I think it's a crucial thing, and we should never forget that. And we should really emphasize that as a contribution that the institutions really make to our society. And I think Jim sort of represented that, because I think he always understood that, while he was also, talking to an employer and figuring out what specifically a Macomb Community College could do for that employer. So that's crucial. But then there's a broader issue about the role of community colleges in society that I think we should not forget, and we should, emphasize and exploit. So.
Appreciate that response, Tom. Kate, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, completely agree with both comments made. I guess the other two things I think about is the importance of collaboration. I think especially now, it's really important that we figure out how to work collaboratively within our communities, but also nationally across the country, to learn from others, to find solutions, to be creative, to be innovative. So that investment in that time. I think there's a tendency when there's so much change and things going on for people just to kind of focus locally. And that really worries me, because now is exactly the time we need to be working together across the country and across our different regions, states, communities. And then I also think the importance of mentorship. So in preparing for this webinar, so many people commented on how Jim was so helpful for their career, who did so much engaged in mentorship. And so I think that's for people at all levels, is especially when there's more and more tasks and priorities on people's plates, not moving away from that and remembering how important it is to mentor future leaders, to mentor current leaders, and to really bring more people along and up and create space for new ideas and new perspectives, because that's key to our field and to really serving our communities. And that I think is also underappreciated sometimes, how much difference that makes and isn't quantified. And many times it isn't visible. So I think that's the other piece I think about.
Very good. Well, let's turn to a couple of questions that showed up in our chat. The first one is from Joel Bloom at SUNY Ulster, and he raises a question about rural community colleges. So Jim, your career was largely in the Detroit area. So what lessons, if any, do you think apply to rural institutions from your work? And if we have time, Joe and Kate, perhaps you could weigh in on that too.
Well, first, I think we do have an expert. Joe is clearly her experience in rural community colleges is I would say she would be best equipped to answer this. But let me just say two things that I have done a little bit of work with rural colleges, and certainly listened to some great presidents of rural colleges. And the three things that strike me. First, the rural community college is really often the only higher education institution in the community, and can play an enormous role as a center for economic and workforce development for what already exists in the community. Again, employers, local employers who need to learn about either new ways of doing business, new technologies, etc. The community college can be the center of that. The second is community colleges are often institutions that can play a role in literally economic development of communities because they have budgets, they spend money, they how much are community colleges sourcing local businesses and providing opportunities for those businesses through their budgets, etc. And third, what are in many rural communities, no question, younger people leave the community. Where do those young people go? If you're in a rural area in the Midwest, it may be cities like Minneapolis or Chicago or Des Moines. How do we prepare students for that experience? So those are some things, but I turn it over to Joe to really amplify.
I'm just going to double click on everything he said. And I would also just say too, that of course, many of the lessons in here, I mean, they are very applicable in that, the leadership lesson doesn't change. So in here, so I would say that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Well, next, let's go to Richard Romano, who asked a question about the students who come to community college often seem to have, different needs or interests than what the employers say they want. So his question is, which is the more important one to satisfy? Jim, why don't you take a first crack at that, and then others
Yeah,
want to jump in.
it's an interesting way of putting it. Since most of our students go back into the community, uh, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess, we always had students who said they were going to leave, or younger students who wanted to move out of the area, and certainly some did. But the overwhelming majority of students, even the younger students, stayed in close proximity, at least to the region, if not in Macomb County. So I'm not sure that there was that much of a distinction between the two, that at least Richard is alleging. The one thing I will say though is that many times there's a difference between the way in which students want to see their opportunities, particularly younger students, and the realities that students who are 25 or 30 years old and having a family, what they think of their own interests. It's always a balance. It's always a balance, and it's especially difficult in different states when that balance has some financial implications. I mean, in Michigan, a good deal of our revenue came from the local millage. So, there was a much clear relationship between what we were doing and what the community, was giving us in terms of funds. In some other states where the budgets are different, it's the state legislature that has, certain amounts of control. But I think for at least our experience is the majority of our students went back into the community. And just want to dovetail something that Tom Bailey said earlier. One of the real hidden advantages that we have not really pursued very well as community colleges is how well we're preparing our students to become leaders in the community. We looked, at our own, we were a large community college, but we had 150,000 alumni living within 10 miles of the institution. We were highly concentrated, and the role that we can play in preparing people for community leadership is very, very much underappreciated, I think, at this point. And it's a great advantage that community colleges have for their future.
We're almost at time, but I'd love to just very quickly, Jim, ask if you could address Claudia Newby's question, which I think is interesting. What's the best advice you ever got about leadership?
The, the best advice I ever got was don't try to do everything all at once, all the time. Timing is everything. That is, it's a never-ending role to be a president. There's always challenges, there's always things to do. To be successful, you have to, again, be prepared to move when the time is right, when you see the conditions, and I think the successful presidents are those who always work 24/7, but are looking for the right opportunities at the right time. So it's I think an important skill that especially those of us who often work too hard and focus too much, etc., need to learn.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Michelle, do you want to close us out here?
Yeah, well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to Jim for sharing your work and for our panelists here for joining this discussion and for everybody who's been on the webinar today, sharing questions and taking part in this. We thank you. We'll be sharing out a recording of this later to those who are here and hope you will have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.